I used to think Christmas was the one night my family could pretend to love me. But 5 days before Christmas, everything I believed about them shattered. I was standing outside my parents' study in our Beacon Hill brownstone, holding a box of handmade gifts I'd spent months creating when I heard my name spoken in the coldest tone I'd ever heard. My father, the chief surgeon, wasn't discussing holiday plans. He was describing my artisan bakery as a malignant growth on the family's prestigious medical reputation. In their world, I wasn't a daughter, I was a complication that needed to be surgically removed. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry. Crying would have required a belief that they were still capable of wounding me. But as I stood in that sterile hallway, listening to my father describe my life's work as a pathology report, I realized I was no longer a daughter to them. I was a clerical error in their prestigious lineage. The air in our Beacon Hill home always smelled of expensive lilies and antiseptic silence, the signature scent of a medical dynasty that values precision over pulse. I turned away from the study, my footsteps muffled by the thick, hand-woven carpets. I walked toward my childhood bedroom. But when I pushed the door open, the girl who had grown up there had already been erased. My sketches, my first artisan baking tins, the faded Polaroids of grandmother Elizabeth teaching me how to temper chocolate, everything was stuffed into gray plastic bins stacked by the door. My parents hadn't even waited for the Christmas gala to start the renovation. They were already converting my space into a home gym for Ethan and Emma, the children they deemed worthy. I didn't ask why. I didn't summon a single word of protest. Instead, I reached into the nearest bin and pulled out the one thing they didn't realize was the real wealth of this family. Grandmother Elizabeth's handwritten heritage recipe notebook. To my father, these were just instructions for sugar and flour. To me, it was a legacy of artisan craft that they were secretly trying to sell out from under me. I tucked the leather-bound book into my bag and felt a sudden, clinical clarity. This wasn't a family crisis, it was a hostile takeover. I pulled out my phone as I walked toward the front door, leaving the box of pastries on the marble console. They wanted to humiliate me at the gala? They wanted to use my failing bakery as a prop for their family legacy video to show how much they had tried to help me? Fine, but they had forgotten one fundamental rule of surgery. You never operate on a patient that has already left the table. With 3 precise taps, I logged into our bakery's shared cloud server. My father had insisted on having access for oversight, but he had really been using it to track my proprietary techniques for his own licensing deal. I hit the remote wipe button. 7 years of recipes, inventory logs, and branding strategies vanished in 10 seconds. Then I went to our family group chat. I didn't type a farewell. I didn't explain the missing data. I just scrolled through the names Aaron, Brian, Ethan, Emma, and blocked them all, one by one. By the time I reached my car, the cold winter wind hit my face, but it felt like a reset button. I sat in the driver's seat, the dashboard glowing with a different kind of sunrise. I wasn't a disappointment anymore. I was a sovereign entity. My father always told me that every successful surgery requires a clean incision. He was right. I had just made the cleanest cut of my life. As I steered the car onto the interstate, the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers against the heavy snow felt like an audit. For years, I had been the silent investor in the family, footing the bill for a legacy that never intended to pay me back. They called my artisan bakery a hobby, an embarrassing little business, but my bank statements told a different story, one of clinical precision and cold, hard support. My father, the great chief surgeon, loved to talk about meritocracy, but he conveniently forgot the winter 3 years ago when a malpractice suit nearly liquidated his private accounts. While he was busy protecting his ego, I was quietly transferring $30,000 of my paltry profits to cover the property taxes on the very brownstone he just kicked me out of. I didn't do it for a thank you. I did it because, in this family, we were trained to believe that being useful was the only way to be loved. This is the trap of cruel normalization. In dynasties like mine, emotional abuse isn't called abuse. It's rebranded as high standards or necessary rigor. My parents didn't see their dismissal of my life's work as cruelty. They saw it as a diagnostic tool, a way to prune the weak branch to ensure the prestige of the whole tree. They had normalized an environment where your value is tied strictly to your title. And since I carried a rolling pin instead of a scalpel, I was statistically irrelevant to their brand. I thought about Ethan and Emma, my siblings who are currently residents at the hospital. I had even paid for Emma's private biotech licensing fees $25,000 when her first startup stalled. They accepted my money with the same clinical detachment they used to accept my handmade pastries, as if my labor was a natural resource they were entitled to harvest. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, assuming the credit line was infinite. The dashboard clock ticked toward midnight, and I realized my relationship with them hadn't been built on love, but on a series of predatory loans. I had spent 27 years trying to balance a ledger that was rigged from the start. I gave them stability. They gave me a seat at the spares table. I gave them loyalty. They gave me a presentation on my failures. But looking at the dark road ahead, I realized the account was finally closed. I wasn't having a breakdown. I was performing a long overdue accounting. Every sacrifice I made wasn't an act of love. It was a subscription to a version of family that had just expired. My father always said that a good surgeon knows when a limb is beyond saving. As the city lights of Boston faded in my rearview mirror, I realized I was finally following his advice. I wasn't running away. I was amputating a dead weight. The weight of their expectations, the debt of their approval. I was leaving it all behind in the snow. I arrived at the cabin in Vermont just as the clock struck 3 in the morning. The silence of the mountains was a physical weight, a stark contrast to the buzzing in my pocket that I had ignored for 3 hours. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the cabin's dark timber walls. An email was waiting. It wasn't from my mother's personal account that would imply a level of intimacy she no longer granted. It was sent from her executive assistant at the hospital. The subject line was logistical update. It was clinical, devoid of any seasonal greeting or maternal concern. It stated that my personal effects had been transferred to a storage facility in a part of Boston where the streetlights were usually broken and the security was adequate at best. This was my mother, Erin's, way of marking her territory. By removing my things from the Beacon Hill brownstone, she was surgically excising me from the family tree before the first gala guest arrived. But it was the second paragraph that revealed the true depth of their ownership. They weren't just throwing me out. They were trying to buy my silence. My father, Brian, and my mother had charitably decided to offer me a position as a data entry clerk at the hospital. They called it a path to realizing my potential and restoring my dignity after the inevitable failure of my bakery. To the outside world, this looked like a rescue mission. To me, it was a leash. They wanted me where they could see me, working a job that didn't threaten their brand, being the living proof that I couldn't survive without their oversight. For a moment, the old guilt flickered the urge to apologize, to return and take the job just to stop the noise. This is what survival looks like in a prison without bars. For 27 years, I had worn the invisible chains of a survivor. When you grow up in an environment where love is a currency and you are always in debt, you learn to keep your head down. You convince yourself that if you just work a little harder, pay another tax bill, or bake a more perfect tart, the bars will finally open. But they don't. The chains aren't made of steel. They are made of normalization. You become so used to the cold that you stop looking for the sun. I stared at the new role description. They expected me to show up at the Christmas gala, stand in the shadow of my surgeon siblings, Ethan and Emma, and accept this mercy in front of 60 relatives. They expected the old Abigail, the one who would swallow the insult and say thank you for the scraps. They didn't realize that when they emptied my room, they accidentally broke the cage. The girl who sought their validation died on the interstate. The woman who remained was through with scraps. I closed the laptop and looked out at the snow. This wasn't an escalation, it was a declaration of war. Olivia didn't just offer coffee when I walked through her cabin door. She offered an autopsy of my family's greed. Olivia is a top-tier intellectual property attorney who handles multi-million-dollar licensing disputes with the same clinical detachment my father uses to remove an appendix. I handed her grandmother Elizabeth's notebook and the few data logs I managed to save before I initiated the remote wipe of my bakery's server. For 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the tapping of her keyboard and the crackle of the hearth. Olivia's face went from professional curiosity to the kind of cold stillness that usually precedes a major litigation. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me like a strategist who had just found the smoking gun. "Abigail," she said, her voice dropping into a register that was purely transactional. "Your parents didn't want to humiliate you because they were embarrassed by your bakery. They wanted to humiliate you because they were terrified you would check your certified mail." She turned the laptop screen toward me. She had used her firm's access to trace a pending patent and licensing application. My parents had been negotiating a deal with a global food conglomerate to license grandmother Elizabeth's artisan bread and pastry formulas. The valuation of the contract was $2 million. $2 million for the very macaroni art recipes they had mocked in the study. But the real incision came when Olivia pulled up the digital copy of the finalized agreement. At the bottom of the page was my name, Abigail Bryancroft. It was an electronic signature, time-stamped 3 weeks ago. I hadn't seen a contract. I hadn't received a single legal notice. My father, Brian, the chief surgeon who preached about the sanctity of consent, had forged my signature to claim that the bakery and all its intellectual property were assets of the family medical estate. My mother, Erin, had witnessed the document as a notary of record. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a felony, clinical, documented, and lethal. I felt a surge of adrenaline that replaced the last traces of my hurt. The family legacy video they planned for the gala wasn't an intervention. It was a psychological operation. They wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would accept the hospital clerk job and never look at my business records again. They wanted me to be the failing daughter so they could be the successful owners of my heritage. I looked at Olivia. I didn't ask her for a shoulder to cry on. I asked her for a timeline. "How fast can we file the injunction?" I asked. My voice was as steady as a surgeon's hand. Olivia smiled, and it was the sharpest thing I had ever seen. "The papers are already drafted. We can serve them at the gala, in front of the board of directors, in front of the 60 relatives they invited to witness your shame." I stood up and smoothed my navy dress. My father always told me that in the operating room, you don't stop until the bleeding is controlled. I was going back to Boston. But I wasn't going back as a daughter seeking a seat at the table. I was going back as the lead investigator in a $2 million fraud. The cash cow they had mocked for years had just developed a very lethal bite. I walked into the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, the epicenter of Boston's medical hierarchy, at exactly 8:45 in the evening. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. 60 of the city's most influential surgeons and biotech executives were there, all dressed in black tie, waiting for the centerpiece of the evening, the Bryancroft Legacy video. My father, Brian, stood on the stage under a spotlight that made his white hair look like a halo. To the crowd, he was the benevolent patriarch. To me, he was a defendant who hadn't been served yet. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The video showed images of me as a toddler, then transitioned into shots of my bakery, filtered to look small, cluttered, and failing. My father's voiceover described the tragedy of a daughter who had chosen a failing hobby over a secure future. He talked about the compassion of a family that was willing to give her a second chance as a hospital clerk. I watched the medical elite offer sympathetic murmurs, their faces illuminated by the glow of my projected humiliation. They were enjoying the show. They didn't realize the script had been rewritten. I didn't wait for the applause. I stepped into the center aisle, the heels of my shoes clicking with surgical precision on the marble floor. The sound cut through the narration. My father paused mid-sentence, his rehearsed smile faltering as he saw me not the broken girl he expected to crawl back for mercy, but a sovereign entity holding a manila envelope. I didn't feel fear. I felt the cold, analytical focus of a closer. "This video is a work of fiction, Brian," I said, my voice cutting through the ballroom like a cold blade. I didn't call him Dad. That title had been forfeited. "You didn't plan this tribute to save my dignity. You planned it to hide a $2 million fraud." The room went dead silent. Even the catering staff stopped moving. I reached the stage and handed him the permanent injunction. Olivia Parker's firm filed this 2 hours ago. The food conglomerate has already been notified that the signatures on your licensing contract are forgeries. My mother, Erin, rushed toward the stage, her face a mask of social terror. Abigail, think about the family reputation, she hissed, her voice low and frantic. We can discuss this privately. I looked at her, then at the 60 witnesses with their smartphones already recording the collapse of the Brian Croft brand. Private is a luxury you overdrafted when you cleared out my room, I replied. I turned back to my father, who was staring at the forensic analysis of his forged signature. The power flip was instantaneous and absolute. He looked at the board of directors, then back at me, his mouth opening as if to negotiate. But there was nothing left to trade. He had spent years treating me like a malignant growth, but tonight, he realized I was the one performing the surgery. I watched his carefully constructed world bleed out in front of his peers. I'm not your hospital clerk, Brian, I said, my voice steady enough to be recorded for the evening news. I'm the one closing your account. Goodbye. The fallout from the Christmas gala was as clean and decisive as a surgical incision. The $2 million licensing deal didn't just stall. It died the moment Olivia presented the forensic evidence of forgery to the board of directors. The food conglomerate wanted nothing to do with a medical dynasty caught in a felony scandal, and they withdrew their offer before the night was over. My father, Brian, and my mother, Erin, found themselves on the wrong side of the law, facing criminal charges for forgery and fraud. The Beacon Hill brownstone, the house that always smelled of antiseptic silence and antiseptic lies, was listed for foreclosure within the month. It was a poetic collapse. My parents had spent so much of their energy performing the role of perfection and maintaining a brand that they had no real substance left to stand on when the facade crumbled. They had built their lives on an illusion of power, and when their credit line of social reputation was finally cut off, they were left with a hollow inheritance and a long list of legal fees. While they were busy managing the wreckage of their reputation, I was busy building a legacy that was actually mine. I secured a $250,000 contract with a national luxury hotel chain, a deal that recognized my bakery as a premium artisan brand, not a macaroni art hobby. They didn't want to license my name to put on a factory-made loaf. They wanted my craft, my vision, and my heritage. I stood in the center of my new studio, watching the snow fall against the massive warehouse windows. This place didn't smell like antiseptic or expensive lilies. It smelled like warm flour, toasted nuts, and absolute freedom. Beside me were the people who hadn't shared my DNA, but had shared my struggle, my chosen family of fellow artisans, and my legal savior, Olivia. For the first time in my life, the air didn't feel heavy with expectation. It felt light with possibility. This is what it means to let go of lineage to find yourself. For 27 years, I had been taught that family was an obligation I had to pay for with my own self-worth. I thought cutting them off was a tragedy, but I realized it was actually a release. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of reclamation. Sharing a surname is a biological coincidence, but sharing values and respect is a conscious choice. I realized that I didn't need their approval to be luminous. I just needed to stop letting them dim my light. I wasn't the failing daughter they needed me to be to feel superior. I was a sovereign woman who had finally learned that success is the most articulate response to silence. I looked at Grandmother Elizabeth's old, flour-dusted recipe book on my bench, the only part of my heritage I bothered to keep, and I knew I was finally exactly where I belonged. I run my fingertips over the worn leather of Grandmother Elizabeth's notebook. The ink is faded, but the truth in these pages is indestructible. My family tried to turn this legacy into a transaction, but some things are too sacred to be licensed. I finally realized that you don't need a seat at a table where you have to beg to be heard. You just have to build your own. If you're waiting for them to see your worth, stop. They never will. But it doesn't matter, because you finally see it yourself. If you've ever been the one who didn't fit in, share this video. Let's show the world that success is the best response to silence. Drop a if you believe blood isn't always family. Don't forget to follow for more stories of justice.